Welcome. We have a special show today. We're heading to the Brooklyn Academy of Music, co-sponsor along with the Rockefeller Foundation of the Pop Tech Conference. This year's theme, The City Resilient, from ecological wallops like Hurricane Sandy to surprise social movements like Occupy Wall Street. Cities are sites of increasing volatility. Are we resilient enough to handle the shocks? Over the next hour, we'll explore what's needed to build a psychological and tangible city wall.
In this session, we're going to do something a little bit differently than we've done before. We have three presenters who are going to give short presentations on their experiences and their points of view on how we make more resilient choices. And then Brian Lehrer, who's joining us as our moderator, is going to open up that conversation, not just with them, but with all of us here in the room. So to start us off, someone who has been working extraordinarily hard over the last few months to lead the development of, I think, something that many people here in the New York area will know well, the SIR report, the administration's resiliency report. Please welcome the president of the New York Economic Development Corporation, Seth Pinsky.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the mayor's special initiative for rebuilding and resiliency. And this effort was an effort that was put into place by Mayor Bloomberg shortly after Hurricane Sandy. And he asked us to answer three questions for him. One was, what happened during Sandy? Two is, what is the future going to look like given climate change? And three is, so what do we do about it? And when we looked at that first question, what we learned about Hurricane Sandy was it was an incredibly idiosyncratic event. For example, it was all about storm surge. There was very little rain, relatively little wind. In fact, the storm surge at the Battery was nearly 40% higher than the previous record that had been set. You'll also notice that Hurricane Sandy was an enormous storm. On the one side of this chart, you see a map of Katrina as it was approaching the Gulf Coast. Hurricane Sandy was nearly 3 times as large as Hurricane Sandy. It took a very unusual track. If it hadn't been downgraded from a hurricane just before it crossed the New Jersey coast, it would have been only the 3rd hurricane to hit the New Jersey coast since 1878. And finally, what you'll notice is that the timing was critical. What you see here is the tidal cycle and the storm surge, and in red what you see is the actual water at the Battery. And what you'll notice is that the surge peaked at almost the exact instant of high tide, which of course was one of the reasons why the surge was as high as it was. And so the lessons that we took from Hurricane Sandy are, first of all, that it's not about preparing for the next Sandy. The chances of all of those things coming back together in exactly the same way are not impossible, but relatively slim. And so instead what we need to do is, first of all, of course, rebuild our city. But second, we need to use Sandy as a harbinger of the type of threat that we face, which leads us to the second question that the mayor asked, which is, what is our vulnerability? And the place that we start when we think about that vulnerability are the FEMA flood maps that were in place when Sandy hit. And as you can see from this map, it covered an extensive area of the city and encompassed many, many hundreds of thousands of people and jobs and thousands of buildings. But as we can see from this chart here, the area in red being the area that was actually inundated by Sandy, the area in blue being the area that had been in the 100-year floodplains, Sandy showed that, in fact, we were much more vulnerable than those maps had initially indicated. Building on this, FEMA released new flood maps very recently, and as you can see from the map in front of you and the chart in front of you, those maps show that, as Sandy indicated, the vulnerability is in fact much wider across all 5 boroughs. But the challenge that we face is that these flood maps are really incomplete in many ways. First of all, they're backwards looking. And second of all, they don't factor in a whole host of different threats that face us from climate change, not just coastal storms, not just sea level rise, but things like heat waves and drought. And so in 2007, Mayor Bloomberg, with the release of his Plan YC, put in place a group called the New York City Panel on Climate Change and asked them to make projections about how climate change would impact the city. And in 2009, they came out with a groundbreaking report that answered that very question. Well, as part of this initiative, the administration asked them to update their findings. And what you see here, I know it's small writing, but are the results of that work. And there are 2 things that I want to point out to you. First of all, it's broad. But second of all, some of the specific findings. One is that with respect to sea level rise in the out years, our experts are now projecting that we're likely to see between 1 and 2 feet of sea level rise, and we could see over 2.5 feet of sea level rise. And this is on top of a foot of sea level rise in the New York area that has already occurred since 1900. Second, just to illustrate some of the other impacts that we might face, whereas today there is on average 18 days of over 90-degree heat in New York City, by the middle of the century, we could see that number more than triple. And in fact, the number of 90-degree days here in the New York area could be more like what you find today in Birmingham, Alabama. That's the kind of climate change that we're talking about. So based on that, we were able to then project forward what the future flood maps might look like. On this slide, you see the 100-year floodplain in blue as it exists today, in yellow what it might look like in the 2020s, and in red what it might look like in the 2050s. And again, you can see how sea level rise is expanding this risk. And we also asked a question of Swiss Re, the reinsurance company. Well, what is the financial implication of all this? And an illustration of this is seen in this chart. Today, a $19 billion storm, which is what Sandy was, happens roughly once every 70 years. By the 2020s, it's projected that this will instead happen once every 60 years. And by the 2050s, it could be once every 50 years. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but what that means is that by the middle of the century, in any given year, there will be a 40% greater chance of a storm like Sandy hitting than there is today. So the lesson that we take from all of this is that we've always been vulnerable to coastal storms, but what we learned from Sandy was that, in fact, we are more vulnerable than we had thought. And what we learned from the future flood maps and the work of the Panel on Climate Change is that, in fact, that vulnerability is going to grow, and it's much more than just coastal storms that we need to be thinking about. And finally, what we learned from this work by Swiss Re is that there is a real cost of inaction, and that's where this special initiative came together to try to address these issues. And as you can see here, we work to address them across a wide range of chapters, looking at citywide systems and infrastructure and the neighborhoods that were most impacted by Sandy. We ended up with a 400-something page report, over 250 initiatives. It includes everything from a nearly $4 billion coastal protection plan to a $1.2 billion plan to retrofit our buildings in the city, to plans for utilities, for our parks, for telecommunications, and plans to make sure that as we rebuild the neighborhoods that were damaged by Sandy, we do it in a better, safer, and smarter way. So I know we're going to have the opportunity to speak in much greater detail about this plan, but let me just say that from the perspective of the Bloomberg administration, what we face today here in New York and in the New York region more generally is a truly existential threat. And every day that we choose not to move forward with plans to address this threat is a day that we fall farther behind the challenge. And so it is absolutely incumbent upon all of us to make sure that our leaders make those investments today and that we start planning for the future, not tomorrow, not in a year, not in a decade, but immediately. Thank you.
I don't think you can ever come to terms with being a murderer. I mean, it's not easy to do, and when you see a lifeless body, it's not easy to deal with. If people knew what I knew, they'd probably be afraid to walk the streets. There's about 6 to 7 mice per one person in New York. This is a cutthroat city, and they're going to have that attitude of, I'm not going to let you stop me. A mouse is considered a pest. They need to be kept away from humans because they get humans really sick. Their feces can cause respiratory infection. Also, they're actually the #1 cause of food poisoning. When they walk over your food, they're actually urinating on it. It's a big problem. There's not one person that loves the mouse, and there's always unwanted, always hated, and still survives, thrives, and lives on. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, as soon as I saw the flooding, I knew it was going to happen. with all the boroughs filling with water, their homes were destroyed just as ours were. Our mouse calls tripled. We were getting calls with people who've never had mice in 40 years. Just families of mice, displaced mice. They're all coming out of the woodwork. They knew that this was coming well before we did. It's amazing that something so small with so many limitations can survive in such a large world. They've been around before us, and they'll probably be around after we're long gone. I have a great respect for mice, but yet I do have a duty to my own species. That's the business that I'm in. Basically, I'm a henchman. I come in knowing what I'm supposed to do, and I do it. Sometimes you get numb to it, and that's just scary. And the day I get numb to it is the day that I'm going to want to get out of this business.
Next, this trio is going to take us from New York to New Jersey to New Orleans. So in our move from New York, we're next going to move to New Jersey. Please welcome the mayor of Hoboken, Don Zimmer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by thanking PopTech so much for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here. As he said, I am Don Zimmer. I'm the mayor of Hoboken, and for those of you who maybe haven't heard of Hoboken, we are just across the river, across the Hudson River. Yeah, sadly, you have heard of Hoboken, and you've heard bad news. That's why I'm going to show you some positive images of our city. This is Pier A along our waterfront. This is a Mumford & Sons concert that we had last year. We just had the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. We've got Bob Dylan coming up. We've got, as you can see, a beautiful view of New York City. So I invite all of you to come and visit our beautiful city. And we've got hundreds of outdoor cafes. We've got the Stevens Institute of Technology that we're extremely proud to have, great engineering school. We've got the largest New Jersey tech meetup in the state. We've got great things happening. So again, invite all of you to come to Hoboken. But sadly, we were, as you all heard, very hard hit by the storm. This shows over on the right, the fire station. We had many public facilities that were destroyed, $100 million in damage. That doesn't include the estimates for the businesses that lost their inventory, and we had over $10 million in public facilities that were damaged as well. So this is just to set the stage. I'm going to talk from this map. It's the western side of our city, away from the waterfront. So the area in the yellow is actually higher. It's higher level, and there was not severe flooding. Where the arrows are, you can see where the water came in, the storm surge came in both from the south and from the north and went to the back end of our city, and as I was quoted in the New York Times, literally filled up our city like a bathtub. The red dots at the back are our substations. So our substations, we're all flooded. We are totally exposed when it comes to our substations. So one of my focuses is to focus on being energy resilient. So I was very proud. We've been chosen by the Department of Energy, Sandia National Labs, PSE&G, and the BPU, part of the state. We are working on an energy resilient plan, looking at how we can create a smart grid, looking at the feasibility of a microgrid system. I heard about Anthony Townsend's great idea and concept today, like we need to be energy resilient. We need to be able to communicate with each other through the storm. So I'm extremely excited about this partnership and really going to be trying to move that forward. We're also focused on a comprehensive solution for our city. I mean, we've got very old buildings. That whole blue area is a lot of old brownstones, a lot of very, tall, 4, 8-story buildings. It's not feasible to raise those buildings up on pilings. So we need a comprehensive solution which we've developed. We want to put more pumps along the waterfront. The white areas at the back is where we're trying to buy land to, and we want to create parks and build either detention systems or different possible solutions to really retain that rainwater. The bottom line is, yes, as Seth pointed out, the storm surge maybe never will happen again, but for Hoboken, as we have that rising sea level, when we get high tide and heavy rainfall, we get flooded. We've had major flood events 3 times since Hurricane Sandy. So it's a major, major problem and seems to be getting worse and worse. So I want to invite all of you. I know I have the experts in the room. Secretary Donovan recently announced a design competition, and you've probably heard about it today, but I think it's a fantastic opportunity, and Hoboken is looking at how can we redesign at the north end of Hoboken. We've got a beautiful park that we're working on designing. We want to do some redesign. How can we redesign that, working with Weehawken, our neighbor, to really protect our community? In the south, how can we protect our community even more, working with Jersey City? How can we use the park space that we're trying to buy? How can we be more green? And we've got a lot of ideas, but we would love to have some partners in applying for this design competition, which I think is a tremendous opportunity for the smaller folks like me. We don't have the resources that New York City has, but we're looking at applying for putting in a lot of different applications for the design competition that's coming up. And the last thing that I will say, and I've got 20 seconds here, is that the core of being prepared is preparedness for the individual. So we are expanding our CERT team. We had over 5,000 volunteers during the storm, and we are focused on helping them to be prepared because, as Seth said, every day we got to get more and more prepared, and that's part of our focus, is making sure that our community individually is prepared, and they're focused on raising those mechanicals out of their basements, making their own individual buildings more resilient. But I would say, going forward, what we need to focus on, I feel, is how can we be resilient, how can we build stronger, be resilient through these storms, because I believe that we can shelter in place, that is one option for us to consider, but we've got to redesign. And when we redesign, we still have to be thinking about the beautiful urban landscape and what makes our cities so special. So again, it's a pleasure to be here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I'm Kara Marks, and I'm from Pennsylvania.
My name is Doğukan Yıldız from Turkey.
It's a difficult moment. Wow. I don't know.
After I was ran over by a train, that was very difficult, to make the decision to live.
I learned quite a bit. I got a lot stronger. That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
The most difficult thing I've ever had to do or deal with was Katrina.
It would have been September 11th. I had a buddy of mine on one of the airplanes that hit the towers.
It was just very low point thing. It didn't feel like things were ever going to get better. It was, the grass was still dead, the trees were still dead. It was rough.
And I was so happy because I'd gotten a stellar report card and I couldn't wait to show it to my parents. And I got to the door and an aunt of mine answered the door and I knew something was bad and my father had died. And that was a difficult moment. Probably the most difficult moment of my life.
I didn't want to live. The angels, they helped me. Somebody, it's not me. I want to be able to do something to help, to help people to be stronger, to go farther, to know who they are. And I really hate to do nothing. That's failure. I have every reason to give up, but really none, and I don't give up. So why should you? Together, people are strong and can overcome anything. As long as you stand together, you will overcome.
One of the reasons we wanted to expand this discussion beyond the scope of just here in New York was primarily because you get to see how people have made choices and fought battles, who've had to fight them and had to resolve them, come up with solutions, and lead over the course of a longer period of time, not just within the last few months in an immediate response, but really over a longer period. And so to lead us in that discussion and to provide her perspective and her narrative, please welcome from New Orleans, LaToya Cantrell.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. You know, when I returned back home after the levee failures of Hurricane Katrina in September of 2006, the first thing that I noticed was a community garden devastated that seniors from my community worked on right before the storm. See, I was a community leader. I was president of my neighborhood organization, the Broadmoor Improvement Association, and at that time, we had to utilize that neighborhood organization to be the drawing point and the consensus builder of how we were going to rebuild our lives, rebuild our community. Now, the catalyst that really brought us together was that there was a Bring Back New Orleans commission that made recommendations to our mayor at the time that certain neighborhoods not return. There were about 7 of them that were big green dots appeared on the front page of our local paper saying, you're not to come back. And I'm quoted as saying all hell broke loose when the Broadmoor neighborhood heard that. See, we were a microcosm of the city of New Orleans demographically and socioeconomically. 68% African American, 25% Caucasian, 3% Latino, 0.6% Asian. Our poverty rate was about 32%, home to 7,232 people, 2,400 properties. We were in the center of the neighborhood. Some called us the bottom of the bowl, but not lower than some other communities. Well, at that time, when we saw that green dot, we began to organize ourselves. We were told, hey, not only are your homes not coming back, your public school, done. Your public library, forget about it. And so although I was leading this community pre-Katrina, I said, no, we're going to do it better. We're going to come back, and we're going to come back better than we were before, embracing those social ills that plagued our community pre-Katrina: low-performing school, mediocre library, substandard housing, some levels of blight. Well, in doing so, we learned very quickly that building public-private partnerships was going to be the way to go, because government had shown us that it wasn't going to be there for us as we needed at that particular time. And so today, the Broadmoor community has led the recovery of the city of New Orleans. It has facilitated the rebirth of its public school, $29 million renovation and expansion. It's a national historic landmark. It has the only library and community center that exists in the city of New Orleans, where the community raised over $2 million to bring that property back as well. We've created an education corridor, is what we call it, that links our library to our school. Also a community health clinic that's down the way. In addition to that, we have started Broadmoor Development Corporation, a CDC, to be that anchor to get in the public dollars and also additional private dollars to redevelop the community. Over the past 7 years, over $40 million of public money has been pumped in a centralized location of the community. But in addition to that, over $10 million that has come through our development corporation. In making sure that this school came back, we had to start a charter school. When we were told no, we said, oh no, we will. So we now have a charter school that's been operating for over 7 years. Student achievement continues to grow. You see, this community was one, as I told you, being that microcosm and dealing with those social ills that plagued us, it was going to be investing in people. And so now, today, residents pay a tax that they voted to incur themselves $100 a year, which then allows us to leverage those resources, be vested in every way as we continue to reach out and to gather private funding. Now, also, I was that community leader, as I said, right? So now I'm standing before you as councilwoman of my district in which my community is. So again, expanding. So what I would say in regards to, thank you for that. Thank you for that. But what I would say in regards to expanding and making sure that we sustain the resiliency that we've seen, we have to make sure that we embrace, we support local leadership on the ground, people who day in, day out, do what it takes to make our communities thrive and survive. That is going to be the way that we need to put in, and not just talking about it, but we have to walk it with our leaders to make sure that they are elected, that people get out and vote, to make sure that our cities come back better than they are before. Now, and I get all excited about that because, well, I do, because it was my work in the Broadmoor community, that voting block, that put me over to then elect me. So it does matter. And we have to make sure that we continue to support our local leaders. When we talk about resiliency, it's about people. And we have to support them. We need you, and I tell you, you need us. Because we are the backbone of what makes our communities thrive, our cities thrive. So I look forward to the conversation that we're about to have. Thank you.
Now, to lead this discussion about how we make more resilient choices, we have our friends bringing the chairs up. It's my great pleasure to welcome one more member of the WNYC community, a man whose deep, penetrating questions have become a lifelong part of my life. Every time I hear Brian Lehrer's voice, I have an urge to brush my teeth, which is an odd thing because the two have become associated in my mind with when I get ready to go out the doors. That should also tell you about roughly what time I roll into the office. As some of you know, the show starts at 10. To lead this discussion with Dawn and Seth and LaToya, please come up and join us. Please welcome Brian Lehrer with all of us.
Thank you. I guess that's the difference between, say, a film director whose work you see in a dark room and you're paying complete attention, and a radio host who you're listening to while you're brushing your teeth or doing the dishes or all the mundane activities of life. So I hope you're paying part of your attention to us when you're listening to the radio. But to Andrew, Zolli, and everyone at PopTech, thanks for inviting me to be a part of this fascinating event, which has dared all day to approach resilience in such an innovative way, ranging from the nuts and bolts of physical resilience to the human imperative of social resilience that we just heard put so eloquently, to the high concept of even what it means to be an urban society in the 21st century. So thank you and congratulations, first of all. It was fascinating to hear the similarities and differences of emphasis among our three speakers just now, who are from three cities which are similar and different. And coming after everything else that you've all been hearing today, let's open it up finally to everyone here at a conceptual level, at a practical level, at a nuts and bolts level. Are you all ready to talk? Does anybody have anything to say? I think probably a lot of people have things to say. Andrew suggested, and by the way, we have mics, 2 mics? Okay, so we have 1 mic, we have 2 mics. I'm going to call on somebody I know first to start out, and that's the former New York City Parks Commissioner, Adrian Benepe, who I know has something to say. Where are you? Over there. Hi, Adrian. So in just a second. But, and Andrew, I'm going to, Adrian, I'm going to put you on the spot because Andrew suggested that I start bringing in people on a kind of conceptual level and ask people what a principle is of resilience that you've come away with. And maybe we can go quickly through a lot of people in the room. Raise your hands quickly if you have a principle after hearing and talking to each other all throughout the day about resilience in the cities. If you have a principle that you want to start out with, and then maybe we can drill down on some of those principles with everybody. So, Adrian Benepe, hi.
Well, thank you very much. You know, I actually don't have a principle because there's so much going on, but rather some questions that maybe will help people think about principles.
Okay, pick your best one, okay, to give a lot of people a chance.
Yeah, this is based on what
20 seconds.
I've heard today. And so it's really 3 questions. One is, there are these 3 government task forces, federal, state, city. Sir just came out. You know, how are they going to come together to address things in either a regional or a coastal way? You know, in New Orleans, you had a regional authority which worked to sort of figure out the coastal defenses. How will this all work geographically and structurally? And I think more important, you know, I'm a reformed government bureaucrat, or recovering government bureaucrat. How do we make sure that our rules and regulations, all the things we live on, don't get in the way of really innovative approaches that scientists and landscape architects and other visionaries bring to this stuff, to the responses?
Well, Seth and Dawn, can it be done regionally? Can, you know, the behemoth New York City and little Hoboken work together toward a common solution to something?
I think the answer is that we have to. And in fact, in many ways, we are working. And we're working more collaboratively, I think, than one ordinarily expects of different municipalities, of different levels of government. You know, the thing about the New York City region is that there's at least some muscle memory of the idea of working regionally. We have a port authority, which is a bi-state authority. We have the MTA, which covers multiple jurisdictions. What we've concluded from the work that we've done is that if we're going to accomplish everything that needs to be accomplished in order to make New York City more resilient, that we have to be working in tandem with other levels of government, certainly with the state government, certainly with the federal government, but also with other municipalities in the region, with the state of New Jersey. In fact, as I said, we have actually begun to do that already. But there needs to be more coordination going forward. And I'll just give you an example. We, for example, in our report talk about ways for us to harden our wastewater treatment plants. With climate change, we're expecting that there will be more combined sewer overflow events, which are basically when the system gets overwhelmed and untreated sewage gets put into the waters, something that we've been investing heavily to try to avoid. Well, we can do that with the facilities that we in New York City control, but if neighboring municipalities don't make similar investments and we don't coordinate with them, our waters will still be polluted during extreme weather events like Sandy. And so we need to make sure that at the same time that we're making these investments, that we're coordinating with these other municipalities. And the list of examples like that goes on and on.
Dawn?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, as I mentioned, this design competition is a great way to kind of highlight there are definitely regional approaches out there. I saw an excellent presentation on a potential regional approach, and if we can get those design concepts highlighted and hopefully, you know, I'm going to be reaching out to the person that I saw do the presentation and potentially building a stronger partnership and you know, putting in a submission between New York City and New Jersey, like that has to be done. And potentially that will engage all of us in the process of looking at, you know, you look at the cost to New York City and then you look at the cost to, you know, the rest of the Connecticut and New Jersey, and if you have a regional approach that really protects the entire area, well then maybe we should all be rethinking this, and maybe, you know, some of the things that I've been putting forward and some of the things that New York City's putting forward, if we can really truly have a regional approach, then maybe that's the direction that we should be going in. But right now, you know, until this design competition was launched, I don't think that there was really a way to kind of highlight some of those designs and ideas, but I really think it's going to be a great
And
great
LaToya, how do you even, and of course New Orleans is so far from New York and Hoboken is not one metro area, but maybe some of the concepts are the same. But one of the things that Seth said really jumped out at me, which is that the next event is not going to be Sandy, even if it's a weather event. So how do you prepare, if that's true in New Orleans too,
Well, I mean,
for the next I don't know what?
Sure, of course. With New Orleans and the way that we've approached this, and even thinking in terms of the region, we took a lot of coordination and coordinating efforts to appeal to the federal government so that our region receives the royalties for offshore drilling that happens off of our coast, which was critical because we have to make sure that we can sustain ourselves. Coastal restoration is real, but when we put the resources where they need to be, we can ensure that we can survive. And that's, we cannot overlook that. And being successful at making sure that we get the money. I mean, the Gulf Coast alone is $7.5 billion annually is off of the coast, off the Gulf Coast, which is higher than or equal to what the U.S. brings in from the IRS. So it's very significant, not only just to our region, but to this country.
So let's open it up to the audience. And I mean, I'll throw out a principle, which is just to my ear, listening to the earlier afternoon sessions, the need for both technological and human connectivity. Because on the one hand, we heard about all the cool apps that are coming down the pike in one session, and then we heard in the next session about kids who don't feel any human connection beyond their 4 blocks. And I think that has social implications. I think that has life and death implications in the worst case scenario of a storm or some other event. So I'll just throw out there, just for me as a participant in the conference sitting in the audience for the last few hours, the combination of human and technological connectivity. How about anyone else? What's important? What are you going to take away from this day? What do you want the world to know from this day? This is going to be all over the internet. This is going to be on television. Sir?
Hi, my name's Noel Hidalgo. One of the questions that I'm trying to understand as a resident of North Brooklyn is that you put economic development kind of right on top of the floodplain map here in New York City. And this is a question that I want to know in New Orleans and maybe even in Hoboken is, do we have to put the rich in harm's way to actually get the type of protections that our waterfront needs?
Well, I can talk about New York City. And one of the things that some people have talked about as a strategy for dealing with climate change is this notion of retreat. And there are clearly limited areas in the city where perhaps it makes sense for us to think about putting natural defenses in place and moving back from the coastline. But today, we have over 500 million square feet of built area in our 100-year floodplain. So the notion that we're going to be relocating those 500 million square feet, which incidentally is more built area than the city of Minneapolis has, the notion that we're somehow going to move that away from the coast, I think is just not realistic. So we as a city with 500 plus miles of coastline have to live with our coastline, and we're going to have to learn how to harden our coast to make ourselves more resilient. What's interesting about the point that you made where you talked about putting economic development in harm's way is that what we actually witnessed from Sandy is that for the most part, buildings, infrastructure that were built after modern building codes were put into place, since people have been thinking about issues like coastal storms and climate change, generally did significantly better than developments that were built before. And so the lesson that we draw from this is that it's not about not developing our coastline. It's about making sure that we develop our coastline in an intelligent way with the kind of resiliency measures that prove to be successful in an event like Sandy and that have proven to be successful in other parts of the world, places like New Orleans, places like the Netherlands, where people have learned the lessons and have, in fact, made the investments that are necessary to protect these areas.
But to follow up on his question, is one of the trade-offs after Sandy the conflict between the value of access to the waterfront and the value of building up in a really well-defended way, which is an expensive way? So is that to say that the wealthy will have even more privileged access to the shoreline in New York than they did before because they're going to be the only ones who can afford to build to the new specs?
Yeah, no, I think the answer to that is no. First of all, again, we have 500 million square feet, so it's not like we're starting from carte blanche. And many of the neighborhoods that are most vulnerable are, in fact, the opposite of wealthy neighborhoods. They're some of the most challenged neighborhoods in the city. The city has a long history, many, many decades before Mayor Bloomberg came into office, of putting affordable housing, putting public housing into some of these areas which turned out to be the most vulnerable areas of the city. So the problem that we have today is not of too many wealthy people along our coastline. The problem that we have is of too many vulnerable people along our coastline. Going forward, first of all, one of the ways that we're looking to defend our coastline is through investments, and this is something that Adrian was responsible for during his years, putting in more public access to our waterfront parks are some of the best natural defenses that there are. And many of the neighborhoods in our city that did well because there was parkland and other public infrastructure in front of them. But also, there are investments that we can make to protect the neighborhoods that are there today and the people who live in those neighborhoods today. And those are investments that in this plan, we plan to make because we don't want to change the character of our coastline. We want to make our coastline better and stronger than it is today.
Thank you. Let's go back to the audience. Who else has a comment or a question?
Hi.
Hi.
Brian, Roland Lewis from the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance. A couple of specific questions and a broad one. For Dawn, the SIR plan that is underneath Seth's seat, and I think is even if you don't agree with every single proposal in it, the methodology and the breadth of it is, I think, an important document. Hopefully for the next administration in New York City, but hopefully also, this is building on Adrian's question about regional cooperation. Just, has this plan that's released only a week or two ago, has it hit New Jersey? Have you been looking at it? Have you heard from the state government that this is an important document? People have been sort of pouring through it just to look at the proposals and how they were arrived at. And then I know we have a sort of $19.5 billion down payment, I would call it. But there's a lot more work to be done that's proposed in the plan. Do you have a rough price tag? And the last one is about resiliency. You know, this is for the entire panel. We think of the waterfront as you know, as a utility, except this utility is not like Con Ed with the electricity or MTA with the subways. It's owned and operated by hundreds, thousands of stakeholders and owners. Okay. Dissemination of these ideas.
The more questions, the shorter the answers.
Okay.
So
right, dissemination.
Give them a very quick response.
Yes, my administration has been looking through that document. I've started looking through it. I think it's a very important document. I think it's very impressive what New York City has done, and we're definitely looking at it. I can't speak for the state, but I'm sure that they are looking at it as well. You know, my challenge has been trying to make sure that everyone is kind of looking at the urban issues, and I do think that, you know, New York City and New Jersey should be working more closely together to try and push the federal government a little bit more with, you know, they need to change their FEMA policies. They need to change their national flood insurance program. I mean, urban areas are completely cut out of the process and the funding. So not New York City, but smaller municipalities like Hoboken, we're cut out. So, you know, I hope that we can work more closely together on advocating for those kinds of issues, because there's changes that really need to happen if we're going to, as a country, protect the future of urban America.
We're also getting questions via Twitter, and I want to jump in and ask LaToya a question that came in. One of them says, this one says, viability of cities is more than a land use issue. If New Orleans is relocated or left to be covered like Pompeii or Atlantis, there goes 40% of the country's seafood industry, a majority of the oil and gas operations. How do we create a fair evaluation of all costs, financial, human, environmental, versus strengthening our resilience?
Oh, wow. Well, I think, first of all...
That might have taken 2 tweets, but...
Yeah, probably. Well, I'm glad they recognize the impact New Orleans has on the seafood industry, but also the impact that the Gulf has on royalties and funding, you know, that it creates and generates for the country. I think that it's going to take us looking at this holistically. When you mention the flood maps, and that's something that we're dealing with right now. They've been recently redrawn. We're now getting a hold of them in our city and trying to learn the impacts that it will have on our urban environment, and they will be significant. But there are ways where we can leverage our resources, where we can work together to ensure that we're a sounding voice when it comes to the federal government, and making sure that, you know, when they're looking at our environments and our vulnerable communities, that our voices are part of that discussion, because it's being left out.
Who else in the audience? Yes. Oh, okay, over there.
Hi, I'm from the Gulf Coast also, and so I'm going to go to your request for tenets about resilience. And so one of them, I think, is that we have to start thinking differently about decision making now, not when there is a disaster, and we have to think about where the locus of decision making lies for different issues. So some of them are regional, some of them are local, some of them are neighborhood based, and we always have to include in the decisions the voice of local people who are going to be most affected. So that would be my tenet.
Thank you. And you want to hand that mic right back to that person there? Hi.
We're talking a lot about the shoreline with the rise of the sea level. What about the subways?
That's a critical issue. The subways, unfortunately, I would say, are not controlled by the city. They're controlled by a state authority, but we certainly are working with the MTA because we know that if the subways aren't functioning, the city, in many ways, is significantly handicapped. And it's not just our subways, it's our vehicular tunnels, it's all of the various modes of transportation. And by the way, it's not just about flooding of tunnels, it's also about the loss of power. Mayor Zimmer talked about the impact that Sandy had on the substations in Hoboken. As everyone here knows, we had similar impacts on many large areas of New York City as well, and those in turn impacted the subways. But again, I think it's really important just to emphasize that coastal protection is critical, and we need to think about coastal storms. But it's not just about coastal storms. We face risks from regular tidal flooding, just like Mayor Zimmer talked about today they face in Hoboken. Going forward, we're going to face even more of that with sea level rise. We face risks from drought. We face risks from heat waves. Heat waves, incidentally, kill more people every year in the United States than any other natural phenomenon. We have to be thinking about all of these different threats, and we have to make sure that we're not just fighting the last war.
I'm curious if you three can talk to each other for a couple of minutes. What did New York learn, Seth, from New Orleans, which had this relatively similar experience years prior? How is this feeding back? Is New Orleans now learning from the Northeast experience with Sandy? Dawn, as a Northeast city, but a smaller city, are you caught in the middle? Just talk to each other.
Well, I mean, New Orleans has oh man, it's wonderful what's happening in our city. And I just spoke about one neighborhood, Broadmoor, but that is replicated throughout the city of New Orleans. It is now, Forbes says we're #1 in terms of repopulation and fastest growing city. We're known the capital for innovation, biomedical industry booming. We are home to the newest VA hospital that's under construction now. We're Hollywood of the South. It's just great what's happening in the city of New Orleans. So I know what's happened there can definitely happen throughout this country and
Dawn, is
communities
there
that have been devastated.
any lesson in that for Hoboken?
Well, I mean, I think in New Orleans, I mean, they were able to get the funding for really almost a comprehensive approach to really protect the city, and I think it was, quite frankly, really disappointing to see the way Congress handled protecting the Northeast, and we got to move beyond that. New York City, I mean, Hoboken's important, but like New York, you're talking about the Northeast economy, and we need to have the funding to protect our region. I mean, we're part of the economic engine of this country, and so I was personally stunned with how Congress handled that, and appreciate Governor Christie kind of stepping in and crossing all, reaching across the table and saying, like, we got to do this. This is ridiculous. And so, I think that the lesson is looking at, the New Orleans was funded. They got the funding to protect their community, and we deserve the funding to protect our area as well.
And in terms of lessons, I would say 3 things. One is I would certainly agree with Mayor Zimmer about the importance of taking the model of the Gulf Coast in terms of funding the rebuilding of the New York area. And one thing that I think is really important to point out is that in New Orleans, in the Gulf Coast, Congress not only moved much faster and came with much more money to the table in the first supplemental appropriation, but actually came back subsequently after the New Orleans area came up with a comprehensive plan for coastal protection and appropriated an additional $9 billion. And certainly to protect the New York area, I think we deserve nothing less than that because of not just the importance of the region, but the number of people here. And the fact that we're just Americans, exactly like the people in New Orleans were. The two other lessons that I would quickly point to are, one, the fact that New Orleans really thought comprehensively about its coastal protection after the storm, worked very closely with the Army Corps of Engineers to develop a region-wide approach to coastal protection. And finally, something that I think is also very important is the involvement from the community level in rebuilding decisions. And certainly that's something that in Mayor Bloomberg's special initiative, he made a priority for us. We met with dozens of elected officials, community boards, community-based organizations, and literally hundreds and hundreds of New Yorkers to get some of the best ideas in the plan.
Well, and that's the benefit, I think, as we look forward in terms of advocacy and us being able to come together to talk and to push these policies forward as it relates to all of us, because it's not a matter of if something else happens, it's a matter of when. That's number one. And number two, I think it's easy and possibly easiest to say that New Orleans funds came so fast, but we're 8 years out almost. And the money didn't hit the ground till about 5 years out. So what we saw was really the people leading the movement, and also the importance and the value of the nonprofit and philanthropic community that stepped up when we didn't know where government was. And the organization that I led in terms of the Development Corporation in the community, for the first 5 years, it was ran primarily 90% on private money. Government showed up year 5. So when you talk about scale and you talk about time, hey, I hope you get it sooner. That's what I say.
All right. I'm being stalked by the digital TikTok over here, which is telling me 1 minute and 20 seconds. Maybe we can go a little bit over that, but I know we have to vacate the space pretty quickly. But let's finish with maybe a little randomness. Let's go around the hall, but I'm talking like 20-second soundbite, folks, so give it your best shot.
Yeah, I'm pretty good at random. This is Carlina Salguero of Portside, New York. And I have a question for the whole room, and then also an offer suggestion to Seth, EDC Sear. And for the whole room, there's been this whole thing about how, government is kind of bad and slow, community is good. There's some communities that don't function well. I've been tweeting about this. I'm looking for tools and advice to help communities that are dysfunctional. At Portside, we work with communities afloat and ashore, and we found troubles in both. And then to the Sear team, it seems it's like heavy on infrastructure, and at Portside we have some ideas about education. We're waterfront themed, as I know you know, for flood prevention, low tech, cheap, and we've been trying to give them away.
So
and
maybe
like
you two need to talk. Where else? Up there, we have a mic for somebody. Where's our floating microphones? Yes.
Hi, my name is Gretchen Manival. I'm from Think Brooklyn, and a lot of great speakers today. One thing that I've been wanting to hear more about is thinking about, like the woman said up here, not waiting to plan in times of crisis and taking the comprehensive approach to planning. So we're not just thinking about environmental planning, but thinking about housing, education, the arts, et cetera. And once we have that social fabric and network and that preemptive planning, that's an incentive for communities to build upon what their needs are and listening to them about articulating those needs in times, not in crisis, but in times of calm. And that is foundational to being able to be successful when there are the times of crisis. So here on the community involvement and the voices being heard of those who are generally underserved. And I'd like to challenge us all to think about that a little bit more and strategic approaches to hearing those voices.
And I don't think we could finish on a better thought than that. So please thank everybody here. And that's our show for today. We premiere a new episode every Wednesday at 7:30. Tune in tomorrow to The Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC Radio, when we'll talk to Emily Yaffe, the advice columnist under the name Dear Prudence for Slate.com. That's 10 a.m. on WNYC. Talk to you then.